Welcome back to the Think See Listen channel, where I give it to you raw and uncut and uncensored, unedited, and completely unprofessional. All for the glory of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, Trinity one essence undivided. This is going to be the beginning of a series, the reading of Wounded by Love by Saint Porphyrios. This book has been such a blessing to me. I'm only halfway about done with it, maybe a little more than half. I've been neglecting this one. This one has had many tears have fallen, such wisdom and such just godly wisdom where you can only see God's hand in this man's life. Saint Porphyrios passed away, or reposed, because Christ destroyed death when he went into Hades, and before he arose on the third day, he destroyed death. Saint Porphyrios reposed and fell asleep in the Lord in 1991, so I was 1 year old, or less, or a couple months more, Well, let's just go ahead and get to it, because I'll just be jabbering on. And we'll just start from the whole beginning, part 1. Part 1, The Life of Saint Porphyrios, 1906 to 1991. The path to the holy mountain. My dream was to imitate Saint John the hut dweller. I'm from the village of Agios Ioannis. That means Holy John, Saint John. There's a village in Evia called Agios Ioannis. That's where I'm from. My parents were poor, and so my father left the village and went to America. He worked there as a laborer on the Panama Canal. In the village, we children did chores from the earliest age. We would water the garden and the trees. We would bring the animals in. We would do whatever jobs the grown-ups told us to do. When I was little, I used to mind the flocks up on the mountain. I was slow-witted and shy. I went to school for only 1 year, and we learnt virtually nothing because the teacher was ill. While I was looking after the sheep, I read the life of Saint John the hut dweller, syllable by syllable. That's where my zeal to go and become a monk came from. Even though I knew nothing. I hadn't even seen a monk or a monastery, nothing. When I was 7, my mother sent me to Chalkida to work in a shop. 7 years old. It sold everything. Shops at that time used to have ironmongery, keys, screws, locks, and ropes, and so on, but they'd also have sugar and rice and coffee and pepper and everything you'd find in a grocer's. It was a big shop. There were 2 other boys there. I went and joined them. I did whatever they told me to. Everyone bossed me about, and I was never off my feet running to and fro. Before I arrived, the 2 other boys had worked out a system whereby they would go up to the balcony day and day about the water to water the basil plants belonging to the boss's wife. They had a rota where, when I arrived, they got me to do everything, to sweep the floor and water the flowers. It didn't cross my mind that it was unfair. I did everything. Wherever they told me to go, I went. One day, just as I was finishing sweeping the shop, I noticed that some coffee beans had spilled on the floor next to where I had gathered my pile of rubbish. There would have been about 15 beans in all. I bent down and picked them up and walked them over to the sack with the coffee beans. My boss was in his office. It had windows all around, and he saw me bending down and then walking over to the sack. He called out, "Angelos," meaning me. That's what they used to call me when I was young. "Come over here." I went over. "What have you got in your hand? What's that?" "They're coffee beans. I found them over there and I picked them up," I said. He started to shout, "Tassos, Aristos, Yanis, Yorios." One was in the storeroom and the others in various parts of the shop. The boss kept shouting. They all gathered in the office. The boss opened my hand. "Do you see that?" "What's that?" he asked. "Coffee beans," they answered. "Where did you find them, Angelos?" "They were littered on the floor, and I picked them up and was about to throw them into the coffee sack," I replied. Well, my boss started to give us a lecture. What went on in that shop was nobody's business. Such wastage. Scoops would be tossed right, left, and center. "Listen now," he said. "As from today, you're going to organize a rota for the jobs in here. 1 week it will be Aristos, 1 week Tassos, 1 week Angelos, for the flowers and for everything." My boss's family was very fond of me. They would invite me up to their house and would get me to sing to them whatever hymns I knew. They looked on me with real affection. My action in picking up the beans had made an impression on them because they didn't know me. After 2 years, I went to Porphyrios to work in a grocer's shop owned by a relative. The grocer's shop was also a taverna. There was a little attic there where I slept at night. The shop was on a hill in Samados Street. People would come by every day to do their shopping, and many of the customers would sit down to have a drink or a snack, since it doubled as a taverna. I developed a deep desire to become a hermit. One day, two elderly men came into the shop. They sat down and asked for 2 sardines and half an oka of wine. I fetched their order at once. Then I heard one of them say to the other, "You should see the wine I drank on the holy mountain. I haven't found wine like that anywhere." "So you've been to the holy mountain, have you?" asked the other. "Yes," he replied. "I left my home in Miletini once. Coloni was my village, and I went off to the holy mountain. We used to drink monoxylitico wine there. What a wine that was." "Did you go to become a monk?" queried the other man. "Yes, I wanted to be a monk, but I wasn't able to. I wasn't up to it. How I regret now that I didn't stay there." I listened to all this with great attention because some time earlier a group of monks had passed by handing out booklets. One was about the life of St. John the Hut Dweller, which, as I told you, I had stammered through syllable by syllable while I was looking after the sheep in the village. I had reread it up in the attic by the light of a little lantern with considerable difficulty because I hadn't learned to read properly. The life of the saint filled me with such enthusiasm that I wanted to imitate him. But about the holy mountain I knew not a thing. Help me read, Lord. "I went to become a monk, but I left," continued the old man. "How marvelous it was there! I saw monks, hermits, holy men, striving to love God and battling away in the wilderness with fasts, deprivations, and prayers, but I left it all behind and returned to the world and snarled myself in 1,000 cares and troubles. I remember it all constantly, and I regret I didn't stay there, instead of landing myself back here in the world with all the troubles and trials of family and children, All these cares of life have brought me to my knees. Yes, I remember it all. See, this is why I want to be a monk too, but I also want to get married. This is a battle. Soon the two men got up and left, but my mind remained captivated by what I had heard. From the moment I was filled with zeal to go to the place he'd been speaking about, my mind became fixated on the idea that I could realize my dream of imitating St. John the hut dweller. It became my all-consuming desire. 2 days later, the elderly man came in again. He lived close by. I went up to him, and out of earshot of others I asked him, "Tell me, Kyridonis, what are things like up there on the holy mountain? Is it a good place? You heard about it last time. I can't tell you anything at the moment." And he didn't tell me anything. He left. But I, in the meantime, could think of nothing else. I developed a deep desire to become a hermit. But how? I didn't know how to get to the holy mountain. I had no money, nor did I know what to say to my boss. Kyridonis came back once more to the shop. Once again I secretly queried about the holy mountain, and this time he told me everything. But how was I going to leave, and what was I going to say? A little urchin, for the love of Christ. For days on end I was downcast and lost in thought. My boss noticed it. He came up to me and said to me, "Why are you looking unhappy? What's the matter?" I'm afraid I couldn't help telling a lie. I said that when I had left the shop to go and fetch some food supplies, I had heard from someone from my village that my mother was ill, and I wanted to go and see her. He believed my story and gave me money for my ticket to go to my mother. He also gave me food to take to her, and showing his sympathy, he accompanied me out onto the road and wished me a safe journey. I ran down to the boat. I had set off for the holy mountain. I had begun to realize my dream. The boat was to sail via Chalkida, Volos, and then Thessalonica. But after the boat had put to sea, I began to feel miserable. I wanted to reach my destination, but I was afraid, and I felt sorry for my parents who, not knowing where I was, would be sick with worry. I couldn't do it. When the boat put in at Limni and Evia, I got off and took the next boat back to Piraeus. I returned to the shop and announced that my mother had recovered, and so I carried on my work as before, but not exactly as before. I was pensive. I prayed continually. I ate little. I made prostrations, and as a result of all this, I lost weight. I changed. What's the matter, Angelos? People would ask me, what's wrong? We can see that there's something on your mind, my boy, and you've lost a lot of weight. You know we're fond of you and we want you here, but do you perhaps want to go back to your parents? Yes, I answered, I want to go home. Go and see them then, if you like, and when you come back, bring with you another good lad like yourself for the shop. And so once again they gave me money, food, and sweets, some bottles of peppermint liqueur, and various other items, and my boss took me down to the boat and bought me a ticket for Chalkida. It was a boat bound for Chalkida, Edipsos, Volos, Thessalonica, and the Holy Mountain, and Daphne. The boat was called Athene. I got on board and the boat set off. It was dark when we left. We sailed all night. Eventually we arrived at Chalkida. When the boat had tied up, the sailor shouted, "Anyone for Chalkida? Anyone for Chalkida?" I kept my mouth shut and didn't say a word. I had snuggled up in a corner and kept quiet. The boat set sail from Chalkida. But when we arrived to Edipsos. The sailors discovered me because they were checking the tickets there. Why didn't you get off at Chalkida? They asked me. I was sleeping, I replied. What are you going to do now? They asked. You're going to have to pay. I don't have enough money, I told them. Never mind then, they replied. And so they took me along without paying. Money at the time was counted in 5 or 10 cent pieces. 1 drachma at the most would have been all I had with me. When we disembarked at Volos, I was suddenly overwhelmed with melancholy. I started to cry and cry. I thought about how I was going to leave the world forever, and about how my parents were going to lose me, and how they would be distressed and worried. I thought about my brothers and sister. Something seemed to be choking me, and I wanted to go back. The boat berthed for several hours at Volos, and everyone got off. Then the whistle blew, and it pulled away for Thessalonica. I stayed on shore, intending to go back. I spent the night up on a hill, crying and praying. The next day I found the boat that sailed the same passage to Thessalonica. I got on board. My money had finished, and so, not having a ticket, I hid myself in the stern so that they wouldn't put me off the boat. At one point, the sailors asked to see my ticket. Of course, I didn't have one, and they berated me loudly. I sat on a bench on the port side of the ship, weeping. As I wept, I looked out at the sea and sang to myself a verse from the hymn I'd been taught by my father, who was a singer in the church. And he used to sing this hymn whenever All Souls Saturday came around. The words ran, beholding the sea of life, swollen high and raging wild, and through temptation's lashing storm, racing on to the calm of your haven fair. I cry, Lord, raise up my life from destruction and save me, O all-merciful. My life, O Christ, is a tempestuous sea, I said to myself, and just as I am sailing on this rough sea, I ask you for your divine providence to lead me to a harbor so that my soul can find stillness there, in the harbor that you are. You who are peace. You who are peace. I said all this, or rather sang it softly, and wept because I was deeply affected by the fact that I was leaving the world. That is, I was leaving my parents. The world didn't matter to me. I wasn't concerned about the world, only about my parents. I was little, and I remembered only my parents, and I was pained that I was leaving them. Midday came, and people started eating on the deck. They sat together in their family groups as people used to do then. Opposite me was a woman with her husband and their 3 children. I was sitting looking out at the sea. At one point, a lady came up because the sailors had asked for my ticket and I didn't have one. People had seen that I was a poor boy, and she tapped me on the shoulder and gave me a piece of bread with 3 little bunches of white bait. In those days, people used to fry white bait in little bunches of 3 tied together with a piece of broom grass, which they passed through the fish's eyes. They would then dust them with flour and fry them. I said to her, thank you very much. Some of the other women who were nearby said to her, well done, that was a kind thing to do. How come you thought of that? It didn't occur to us. The woman, however, turned round and said to them, no one should bother about children like that, little urchins, nor give them anything. But what are we to do? We're human too. When I heard the words, little urchin, I, poor little wretch, suddenly felt a surge of happiness inside because I thought that I really am a little urchin. I had become a little urchin for the love of Christ, and I said to myself, oh Christ, save me and guide me. Save me and guide me, Lord. Eventually we arrived in Thessalonica. We got off the boat. I didn't know where to go. I went to the church of Saint Demetrios and kissed the icons. I knelt down, weeping, and implored the saint to come help me to become a hermit. That was my dream. Then I climbed up a hill and came to a little church, a country chapel. It was locked, but outside there was a wooden bench. I stayed there all night. I cried a lot. I wanted to go home to my parents. There was a sore temptation for me. 3 times I went back while I was weeping. I went repeating the words of the hymns of supplication to Our Lady that my father had taught me. Do not despise my supplication. Do what's profitable to my soul. I said this again and again through my tears, and so I fell asleep. I forgot to tell you what I did with the presents that my boss had given me, supposedly to take to my family. I gave them away to some young conscripts on the boat. I gave away the chocolates and the bottles of rose and peppermint liqueur, and so I got rid of them. The soldiers were at a loss to understand why I was giving the things away. I was a little boy, but they took them all the same. So as I was saying, I fell asleep outside the little chapel. I woke up in the morning. I went down to the sea, got onto the boat. The temptation was too much for me, and returned once again to Piraeus. What can I say? It's a long story. I took a firm decision to leave and not come back. Following all these futile journeys and about turns, after some time had passed, I took a firm decision to leave and not come back. I resolved not to get on the boat again. Not to get off the boat again. I resolved not to get off the boat again. Once I embarked from Piraeus without return for the holy mountain. It was the 3rd time I was setting out, the last after all my misadventures. When we arrived in Thessalonica, it was Saturday. At this time, Thessalonica was dominated by the Jewish community. People didn't work on Saturdays. It was a ghost town. Everything was closed, neither boats nor sailings. We had arrived late on Friday evening. Everyone got off the boat to buy something to eat. I didn't get off because I was afraid of temptation. I was frightened that something might happen to me and I wouldn't arrive to my destination. I gave someone 15 cents and he brought me bread and mackerel and I ate. For the whole day we all waited in the harbor because, as I said, nobody was working. As evening approached, monks started to arrive and board the boat. I watched them in awe. For the first time I was seeing monks in their cassocks. I had positioned myself by the gangway, and from where I stood, I could see them all passing by. At one point, a tall, elderly, and venerable-looking monk with a long beard and with a haversack on his back walked up. He came towards me. He took a seat on a bench and motioned me to sit down too. "Where are you going, my boy?" he asked. "To the holy mountain," I replied. "And what are you going to do there?" Concealing the truth, I answered, "I'm going to work." "Come to Kavzo-Kalivia," he said. "That's where I live with my brother in a hermitage in the desert. Come along, my boy, and we'll all glorify Christ together." Then he asked me, "What books do you read, my boy?" "The Letter of Christ, the Letter of Our Lady, and the Life of St. John the Hut Dweller," I answered. "I haven't been much to school." He made no comment about the books, about whether they were good or not. "Come with me," he said. "We've got work there and we'll pay you, and we might even make you a monk. We might even make a monk of you." As soon as I heard that word, a smile crossed my face. Then he said to me, "Listen, my boy, don't be upset at what I'm going to tell you. Young boys are not permitted on the holy mountain. You're very young, and they're prohibited from allowing you to enter." My face fell. "But don't worry," he said. "We'll tell a little lie and God will forgive us." In God's eyes, it won't be a lie but a truth, because you love Christ and you want to go to the holy mountain to worship Christ. So whoever asks you, what's your relationship to the elder, you'll reply, he's my uncle, and I'll say that you're my nephew, my sister's son. Lots of other monks crowded on the boat. Night fell. The monks all huddled close together and each took out his food. We sat close to them too. The elder gave me a bread to eat. What's your relationship to the boy, holy confessor? They all asked. He's my sister's son, my nephew. My sister has died, and because he's an orphan, I've taken him with me. It's so cool, man. I've got a little Holy Spirit passion drops coming up into my eyes, because of the Holy Spirit fire, and it's boiling up into my eyes right now. A great miracle of God's providence. We sailed all through the night. In the morning, at about 10 o'clock, we arrived at the port of Daphne. All the monks heaved up their haversacks, filled with the items they had bought in Thessalonica for their various handicrafts. We walked down the ship's gangway. A rowing boat was waiting for us. My elder was given preference because he was a confessor and spiritual father. We clambered first into the little boat and arrived at the steps at Daphne. We got out. But then what happened? The elder distanced himself a little from me to find a spot to lay down his haversack, and at that moment a tall guard, dressed in his white kilted skirt and crowned with his red fez and black tassel, grabbed hold of me and threw me back into the boat just as it was about to set out again to fetch more monks. "What business do you have here?" he shouted. "Children aren't allowed. Get back to the boat. Off you go." I started to cry. The boat began to pull out. At that moment, however, my elder noticed what was happening and ran shouting, "Stop! Bring the boy back! He's mine!" The boat rowed back and I was freed. Then the Sardaris said to him, Sardaris was what they called the guards on the holy mountain. At that time they wore white kilts and a red fez, sterling fellows. They were present everywhere at all official ceremonies. So the Sardaris said to him, "Father, you're not allowed to take the boy with you." "I've no choice but to take him. He's my nephew," said the elder. "He's my sister's boy, and I can't leave him. He's an orphan. He's nowhere to go." "That's fine, but I'm the one who'll be in hot water if I let the boy in. Don't worry, whatever happens, refer the matter to me. I'll speak to the elders and you won't find yourself in any trouble." And so with the elder, my uncle, who indeed became my elder and spiritual father, Panteleimon was his name. He went up to the skeet. By all this I want to show how God worked many miracles on me, unworthy as I am. His hand very manifestly protected me everywhere, and so in this case the hand of God led me into the hands of a holy elder and spiritual father who was to protect me. God had sent him, and this elder saved me. It was a great miracle of God's providence. In many things God's providence has helped me, but above all, the great assistance I received was that I succeeded in going to the holy mountain at such an early age, in spite of the fact that it was forbidden. I knew nothing about monastic life, but God helped me. And as I told you, we arrived at the skeet. From that time onwards, it was a different life, a life in Christ, a life of worship, a life free of care, a life of resurrection. Holy Mountain, Kapso-Kalivia, 1918 to 1925. My life on the holy mountain was prayer, joy, and obedience to my elders. When I went to the holy mountain, I was young and uneducated. If I were to tell you about my life on the holy mountain, my love and my devotion, time would fail me to tell. My love for you incites me to tell you what I remember. When I went to the holy mountain, I was, as I told you, young and uneducated. I didn't know how to read. I read syllable by syllable. My elders were brothers, Elder Pantaleimon, the confessor, and Father Ioannikios. Asked me, "Can you read?" "A little," I answered. It was Saturday evening. They set me to read the Psalter. Shyly, I started to stutter the words of the first psalm. Blessed is the man. "That's fine, my boy. Let me read now," said Father Ioannikos, "and you can read another day." He donned his glasses and started. "Blessed is the man who has not made his way." You can imagine my embarrassment. That was a lesson for me. I must learn to read, I resolved, and so I quickly set to work. Whenever I found a spare moment, and I had lots of free time, I would read the Psalter, the New Testament, and the poetic canons from the daily offices to loosen up my tongue, and from the countless times I had read it. I learned the Psalter by heart. I read even during the night. I felt that I was no longer on earth, but that I had been transported to heaven. One night there was a vigil service at the Kyriakon, the Church of the Holy Trinity. This was very shortly after I had arrived. During the first few days, our skete was celebrating its feast day. My elders left in the early evening for the church and left me in the hermitage to sleep. I was young, and they thought I might not be able to stay awake until the morning, when the vigil would end. After midnight, Father Ioannikios came and woke me up. "Wake up and get dressed," he said, "and we'll go to the church." I jumped up at once, and in 3 minutes he had arrived at the Holy Trinity Church. He ushered me into the church first. It was the first time I had been inside. I was overwhelmed. The church was filled with monks standing upright in an attitude of reverence and attentiveness. The chandeliers shed their light everywhere, lighting up the icons on the walls and on the icon stands. Everything was bright and shining. The little oil lamps were lit, the incense exuded fragrance, and the singing resonated devoutly in the otherworldly beauty of the night. I was overcome with awe, but also with fear. I felt that I was no longer on earth, but that I had been transported to heaven. Father Ioannikios nodded to me to go forward and kiss the icons. I remained motionless. "Take my hand, take my hand," I gasped. "I'm scared." He took me by the hand, and gripping him tightly, I went up to venerate the icons. It was my first experience. It was engraved on my innermost soul. I will never forget it. I went through a period of temptation. I was very happy and enthusiastic about my life there. In the beginning, however, I went through a period of temptation. I started to think about my parents. I felt sorely for them. I was pained that they didn't know where I was. I thought about a cousin of my own age. I developed a desire to go to my village for a little and bring my cousin to the holy mountains so that he too could experience this wonderful life. I felt that I had no obligation to bring him to Christ. I didn't say anything, however, to my elder, and so I started to lose my appetite for food. My face grew pale, and I became melancholy. My elder noticed all this. One day he called me over and said to me, with concern, "What's wrong, my boy? What's the matter with you?" I told him everything. That was the end of it. I was freed. The temptation passed. My appetite returned, and joy flooded my heart. I continued in obedience to my elders. My face shone. I grew more handsome and good-looking. Although I had been thin and scrawny to begin with, I later became quite handsome. My face became angelic. How did I see it? I had gone to see my elder, and as the sun struck his window, it became a mirror for me. And when I saw my face, I said to myself, "Goodness, how the grace of God has changed me." To begin with, I thought about my parents and thought of them and the thought of them tormented me. Later, I didn't think about them. I remembered them only in my prayers for the Lord to save them. At first, I longed for them. Later, my longing was for my elders. I commemorated my parents in my prayer, but in a different way, only with the love of Christ. I started to fast more and to make greater ascetic effort, and I was filled with even greater mania and enthusiasm. I longed to be in the church continually, and I wanted to do whatever the elders wanted so that I could please them. There you see is the change, the transformation worked by the grace of God. I loved my elders. As I've said before, my elders were Father Panteleimon and his brother Father Ioannikios. I loved them. Though they were very strict, at the time I didn't realize this because I loved them. I had the impression that they didn't treat me with austerity. I had great respect, devotion, and love for them. My devotion was it that I saw the icon of Christ? Was it that I saw the icon of Christ? Such was my awe and such my devotion. After God came my elders, they were both priests. They came from the Karditsa area, from a village that is high up. What's the village called? It's worth recalling the name of the village. Yes, I remember, it's the village of Messenicolas, near Karditsa. That's where my woolen blanket is from, the one I slept in until recently. I was utterly obedient to them. Obedience! What can I say? I truly knew the meaning of that word. I abandoned myself to obedience with joy and love. It was this absolute obedience that saved me, and it was on account of this that God gave me his charismatic gift. Yes, I repeat, I was utterly obedient to my elders, not forced obedience, but with joy and love. I loved them truly, and because I loved them, this love made me sense and realize what they wanted. I knew what they wanted even before they asked, and not only what, but also how they wanted each thing. I went here and I went there. I was devoted to them, and so my soul was winged with joy, and I was with them. I thought of no one else, not my parents, not acquaintances, not friends, or the outside world. My life was prayer, joy, and obedience to my elders. If they said something to me once, I would observe it always. For example, the elder once said to me, "Wash your hands before you eat, and every time we are about to go to the church, because we are entering a holy place, and everything must be clean. Remember, we are both priests, and we celebrate the liturgy. We need to have our hands clean, and to have everything about us clean." And so, every so often, I would wash my hands with soap. There was no need for them to tell me a second time. Before I ate, I would soap and wash my hands. If we needed something in the church, I would wash my hands. If I picked something up, then I would wash my hands. When delicate work was required in my handicraft, I would first wash my hands. I did the same with everything without the slightest thought of demurral and remember that I had 2 elders, and often they asked for conflicting things. One day, Father Ioannikios said to me, "Take these stones from here and carry them over there." I took them to the place he showed me. Then the father confessor came by. As soon as he saw them, he scolded me angrily, saying, "You crooked fellow! Why did you do that? Is that where we want these stones? Take them back to where you found them." Whenever he got angry, he would use the phrase, "You crooked fellow," and to scold me. The next day, Father Ioannikios passed. He saw the stones in their original spot, and he fumed at me, saying, "Didn't I tell you to take the stones over there?" I hung my head and blushed. I made a penitent bow before him and said, "Forgive me, elder. I had carried almost all of them over there, but the other elder saw me and said, 'Take them back where you found them. That's where we need them.' And so I took them back." Father Ioannikios said not a word. They did things like this to me often, but I never suspected anything. I didn't think, "Are you doing this to test me?" I never discerned however, that they were testing me. But even if they were testing me, things occurred so naturally that I never realized it. That's important, because if someone knows he is being tested, he can do the hardest of tasks to show that he is being obedient. But if he is unaware that someone is testing him and indeed sees that person agitated and angry, then he can't avoid reacting and thinking, "Look at that now! Has this man been a monk here for all those years, and yet he still cannot control his anger? Can this be possible? Can a monk be irascible and pray? How has he not managed to rid himself of anger? These men are very imperfect." At all events, I didn't think in this way, nor did I know whether they were testing me. On the contrary, I took great delight in these incidences because I loved them. But they too had great love for me, even if they didn't openly display it. I loved both my elders, but I leaned particularly for support on the one who was my spiritual father, Elder Pantaleimon. Just as David says, "My soul is stuck fast behind you, your right hand has supported me," so my own soul stuck fast to my elder. This is quite true, and my heart was with his heart. I watched him, I sensed him. He took me out and we went to the Kyriakon, and from there we went to our various tasks together. It's incredible how much I sensed him. That sanctified me greatly. The fact that I stuck to him like a leech sanctified me. The fact that my heart was glued to his heart worked wonders for me. He was a very great saint. And yet the elder said nothing to me. Not only did he not tell me where he came from, he didn't even tell me his surname. Nothing. He never said, "In my village," or "my parents," or "my brothers." He was always silent and always praying and always meek. If he got angry any time, his anger and everything he said was all feigned. I loved him, and I believed that through my obedience to him and with my love for him, that grace he possessed visited me and stayed with me. I observed him in order to take something from him, to imitate him. I loved him, I revered him, I looked at him and received benefit. It was enough for me simply to look at him. He would go together on an entire expedition. We would go together on an entire expedition. We would walk from Kavzo-Kolivia up onto the mountain to cut holm oaks. All the way he would say nothing, not a word. I remember my elder showing me which oaks to cut. As soon as I cut one, I shouted with delight, "Elder, I've cut it!" He said, "Go there with your saw." I cleared the brushwood round about so I could get it with my saw. He would then go to find me another. We would use the phrase, "with one puff," that is, at a single stroke. Again, I would cry out, "Elder, I've cut it!" With delight. These weren't natural things. It was my love, it was the grace of God that was transmitted from the elder to me, a humble boy. Do you remember the story that's told about a group of monks who used to visit one of the desert fathers and inundated him with questions? One of the monks would sit saying nothing and simply looking into the elder's face. In the end, the Abba turned to him and said, "Why don't you ask anything? Have you no questions at all?" The monk replied, "I wish for nothing more. It's enough for me to simply look at you, elder." You see, he was gracefully enjoying him. He was inhaling him. That is, he was breathing in the grace of God through him. Saint Simeon, the new theologian, says the same thing. He confesses that he too received grace from his elder. Whatever I did with joy. My elders didn't give me heavy chores to do. I simply watered the garden and did my handicraft, that is, my wood carving. Nor did they give me instruction. To begin with, I went with them to the church services, nothing more. After some days, the elder called me over and gave me a prayer rope and told me to repeat the prayer, "Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy upon me," every night. Nothing more, no instruction, no explanation. Before he gave me the prayer rope, he said, "Look, make a bow, kiss my hand, and kiss the cross at the top of the prayer rope so that I may give you a blessing that God may help you." That was how I learned to pray with a prayer rope. To begin with, they didn't send me on errands outside the hermitage. Whatever jobs I did in the house. When I went out to the garden, I dug, watered, weeded, and whatever else I could. Later, I started to learn wood carving. Once my chores were finished, they got me to read the Psalter while they worked. I was conscientious in my work, and I didn't want to disappoint them in any way. My only thought was how I could serve and please my elders in everything. Whatever they told me to do, I did, observing their instructions exactly. In order to be sure about what I was doing, I ran over in my mind again and again with what they had said, learning it like a lesson. I worked over their words in my head. For example, my handicraft was wood carving. I watched how the elders went about it, and at night when I went to bed, I went over the lesson in my mind. We take the piece of wood, we cut it, we place it in the water to soak, then we take it out and leave it to dry, then we cut it into shape, we plane it down, we smooth it with sandpaper. We take the rasp and we work it this way and that way. Then we take a chrysolite sea stone that makes the wood shine. They call it adamantine. Then we trace out the design, etc., etc. I went over the whole process in my mind so that I wouldn't forget the slightest detail and so that I would do the job exactly as they wanted. I was afraid I might make some mistake and upset them, and so whatever they told me I learned by heart. They explained to me why it was essential for me to learn a handicraft. They said, "Be sure to learn your handicraft, otherwise you can't survive here. This isn't a monastery, a coenobitic monastery, that is, with lots of produce from fields, orchards, and vineyards. Here you have to work to buy your biscuit." They explained this to me and taught me the art of wood carving, and so, as not to disappoint them, I mentally revised what I had learned at night when I went to bed, and as I said, and so in the morning, I was ready for work. Whatever I did with joy. I said to myself, I'm going to become a monk, and I have to learn what that means. I was inquisitive to learn everything in all its depths and breadth. I wanted to learn everything. I received my elder's blessing and read the service of monastic tonsure. And my elder's blessing I received my elder's blessing to read the service of monastic tonsure, and in 2 weeks I had learned it all by heart. It was not, of course, that I thought I would later become a preacher and that I would be able to make use of this knowledge, but simply out of love for Christ. I accustomed myself not to leave my thoughts free in order to acquire purity of mind. On the bench where I was working, where I was doing my wood carving, I also had the Holy Scriptures. I opened them and read. I had the Gospels, and I read them from the beginning of the Gospel according to Saint Matthew, the book of the generation of Jesus Christ, son of David, I read, worked, and repeated the words in my head. I repeated the words of the Gospels innumerable times, and I remember them even now. What I wanted was to have holy words in my head. I never tired of repeating them again and again. I loved the divine words. I sensed them vibrantly and fathomed them ever more deeply. I would repeat them insatiably all day long, even if I repeated them every day. I never tired of them. I had great enthusiasm, and when my elders would leave in the morning and return at night, I would be free and would go to the little chapel of St. George's and devote myself to prayer. I would go there, yes, and what would happen? I would be so filled with exhilaration that I wouldn't eat. I didn't want to be distracted, you understand? I repeated the Jesus prayer. I sang and read it, and I read. I went there on my own. I had a really good voice. It's true. I had a really excellent voice. I'm not telling you this now in order to compliment myself, but because that's how I felt. I had a very good voice, and as I sang the words sounded like laments. They were love songs. They were for Christ. They were whatever you like. You understand? My goodness. How many funeral services? How many whatever you like, such like things I sang. What can I do to make you there? Such like things I say. Something I have experienced, you understand? As time passed and I grew up a little and became stronger, the elders started to send me on errands outside the hermitage. In our hermitage in Capzo we didn't have topsoil, and we brought it in from a considerable distance, lugging it on our shoulders. When I used to go in obedience to fetch earth and walked over towards Saint Nifon's cave, it was my habit not to leave my thoughts to roam free, but to learn by heart passages of Holy Scripture, the Psalms, and the poetic canons. I did this in order to have purity of mind. I never imagined that I would ever use the things I learned by heart in the way preachers do to speak in public and give sermons. I never imagined that I would leave the desert. Such a thought never entered my head. I believed that there I would remain and there I would die. But without my realizing it, and without my wishing, I found myself outside the holy mountain. I stretched forth my hand and preached a sermon. One day my elders sent me to bring earth over to the skeet. Once I had walked some way along the path to St. Nifon's chapel, I was, as usual, going over in my mind the words of St. John's Gospel and gazing out at the Aegean Sea, which stretched out in horizonless infinity. I stopped for a moment on a rock, breathed in the fragrance of the thyme, and exhilarated by the exuberance of nature. I started to shout. I stretched forth my hand and preached a sermon. Yes, I assure you, it's quite true. I laid down the sack I was taking to fill with earth, and, standing on the rock, I stretched out my hand, and in a loud voice, and speaking deliberately, I commenced, And this is the judgment, that the light came into the world, and men loved darkness rather than light, for their works were evil. For everyone who does evil hates the light, and does not come towards the light, in case his works be reproved. I recited the passage to the end, and whom did I address this sermon? And to whom did I address this sermon? To the empty air, to the sea, to the whole wide world, without anyone to hear. I preached it in the midst of the wilderness. Well, what sort of things should I tell you about? I tell you about the things that I loved, and I remember them so vividly. I ran, I didn't walk. I didn't want at all to stay still. I wanted to be always on the move, watering plants and chopping wood, and everything was done with a bow and blessing. I was filled with joy and exhilaration. I felt full and overflowing, and I ran. I didn't walk. I was embarrassed, however, to let the elders see me running, and so I walked slowly to begin with, and when I was out of sight, I started to run. I took wings in order to go quickly and return quickly to my elders. A life free of care, what can I say? This life is truly angelic, and that blessed elder of mine was also full of eagerness for activity. He would say to me, "Go here, go there." It's true, of course, that we had lots of jobs to do. They had given me responsibility for the hermitage. We kept a house well ordered and well looked after. We had olive trees. We had a few fruit trees, and we had a vegetable garden. The work naturally made me tired. I did lots of jobs. I went up to the mountain. My feet often got cut. How were my elders to know? They saw me as a child. When I came down from the mountain after walking for 3 hours, Father Ioannikios might say to me, "Tomorrow we're going to make bread, so get ready now and go and fetch wood for the oven." So I would take a rope and go up the mountain for branches. I would walk on paths, but also over rough ground. The elders would often send me to fetch logs or sticks, and I would load them onto my back like a donkey, and fully loaded as I was, and my back aching, I would sit on the stone wall to rest. If the load was particularly heavy, I would say to myself, "I'll show you, you old donkey." I didn't know the meaning of laziness. Indeed, I didn't show any pity for my body. If my knees hurt, I wanted to take revenge on them. The more they protested and hurt, the greater the burden I loaded on my back. "I'll show you, you old donkey," I would repeat. I took revenge. I took revenge on my bad self. It's incredible that when I was a 17-year-old boy, I loaded myself with the weight of almost 200 pounds and carried it all the way for a distance, say from Ammonia Square up to the top of Lecavitos Hill. A steep climb over 1 kilometer. There was no question of laziness. I liked to pray even when I was tired. When I was exhausted, I sought God even more. You must believe this and realize that it's truly possible. It's a matter of love. It's not simply that you work quickly. You do one job, then you begin another. You come back and do yet another, and you make sure that you finish them all. You water, you hoe, you bring earth and branches, you go up to the mountain, you fetch wood for wood carving. With love, you are in perpetual motion. You should see then where sins go. They all fall into a deep sleep. Do you hear? This is truly a life lost from the world, a blessed and holy life, a life in paradise. See, that's why I think being a monk sounds awesome. I could work for God 24/7 and not to pay taxes and bills. That's why it just sounds like such a good idea. I guess I might leave it at that for this session. I love reading this book. It's so full of wisdom and beauty and such a blessing. I pray that it blesses all who have gotten this far. If you've made it this far, drop a like, comment, tell me what you think. Part of my job, I think, is to create as many Orthodox Christianity nerds as possible. So I just pray that this is a blessing to you, as this blesses me so much. So, Saint Porphyrios, pray for me, pray for everyone who hears this, and bless them with your wisdom. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, now and forever, into the ages of ages. Amen.